who have had their important and necessary civil protests hijacked by a nihilistic, anarchistic element wishing to sow mayhem and destruction. And third and finally, the many small businesses that were already facing an existential threat from COVID and now have had their premises smashed and their inventory looted. This wave of looting hit the cannabis industry particularly hard, with dozens of dispensaries across the country being victimized by violence and theft. The need for the restorative and healing nature of our plant-based industry could not be more urgent, and the need for solidarity and cooperation within our industry and its stakeholders has never been more paramount. To that end, globalgo is initiating a matching campaign in support of the Last Prisoners Project. globalgo will match all donations made today to Last Prisoners Project up to the amount of $5,000. You can find a link to make a donation on your screens. I encourage everyone attending today's webinar to make a donation, and together we can help be a much needed force for timely prisoner reform in support of the tens of thousands of citizens serving hard time for cannabis offenses. As we know, cannabis laws have been used to disproportionately target and penalize members of the Black and Brown community in particular, and this initiative is a great way to address that injustice. Despite present challenges, our incredible industry continues to flourish and grow rapidly and create incalculable benefits for society at large, be it providing patients in need with compassionate care, enfranchising historically groups victims unfully by the war on drugs, fomenting a new class of dynamic canna entrepreneurs who are creating and building transformative new businesses, which in turn are employing tens of thousands of individuals in an industry they are passionate about, and padding the depleted coffers of federal, state, provincial, and municipal budgets. Now, my colleagues and myself launched globalgo in 2019 to help engineer the globalization of cannabis in anticipation of a post-prohibition era. What can globalgo do for you? Well, whether you want to scale your company into the first truly global hemp or cannabis business, or you want to transform your brand into the leader in your local market, the globalgo team provides the expertise you need to build your business and a menu of service offerings to get you to your goals faster. globalgo has tapped an international of facilitators to expand the value of cannabis businesses across state and sovereign borders. With affiliate offices in Colombia, South Africa, Switzerland, the UK, Mexico, and Canada, globalgo is the cannabis industry's first and best global advisory platform and can add value to your business, whether large or small, domestic or international. So give us a call and let us share our expertise to help you maximize your enterprise. Okay, with that out of the way, I'd like to get on to our program. I am so excited to begin by introducing our keynote speaker, Fiona Ma. Fiona Ma is California's 34th state treasurer. She was elected to her post in November 2018 with more votes than any other candidate for treasurer has ever received in the state's history. Fiona is the first woman of color and the first certified public accountant elected to the position of treasurer. Now, California is the world's 5th largest economy, and Treasurer Ma is essentially the state's primary banker. Her office processes more than $2 trillion in payments within a typical year and provides oversight for an investment portfolio of more than $90 billion. And no, cannabis entrepreneurs, I am sorry to report that Treasurer Ma's investment portfolio does not yet include exposure to the cannabis industry, but perhaps soon it will be the case. Before being elected treasurer, Fiona was an elected member of the California Board of Equalization and was a member of the State Assembly from 2006 to 2012. As an assembly member, she authored 60 bills that were signed into law, and her successful legislation to ban toxic chemicals in baby products became a model for federal legislation that was authored by U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein in 2008. Amongst her other accomplishments, Fiona chaired the Assembly Select Committee on Domestic Violence and spearheaded legislation that strengthened laws protecting victims of domestic violence, consumers, and working families.
Are they right there? Are you going to be on them?
I could go on. but I'd rather Treasurer Ma speak for herself. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please extend a warm welcome to Treasurer Fiona Ma.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me? Okay, great. I apologize if my dog starts barking. Normally I am in Sacramento for the past 10 weeks, but because of the riots that are happening around the Capitol, my office is right there in front of the Capitol. We have been advised to stay home. So I may have a couple disruptions, and you may hear my dog barking when my father comes back from getting his newspaper. So this is the new reality of us all staying connected and still making sure that, you know, whatever business industry that we are in, that we are going to be able to continue and survive and prosper post-COVID. Thank you, Paul, for your introduction about everything that is going on in this world right now. And it is sad that the peaceful protests have been hijacked by looters and rioters, and it's really taken an unfair toll on the cannabis industry, because it seems like these folks are specifically targeting cannabis specifically because of one of the problems and the issues that I've been working on for the last 6 years is trying to bank the industry so that folks don't have as much cash at their homes and at their businesses. The good news is that there are more banks in California that are accepting cannabis clients legally by applying to the federal government, doing all their due diligence, abiding by the Bank Secrecy Acts, the FinCEN guidelines. And so there are more and more banks coming online, but clearly not enough. Plus the costs and the fees are really expensive to have a bank account. But given the situation and what we're actually seeing in real time, it's probably worth the extra money for folks to spend. I just want to give a little bit of a background about myself. I am a CPA by training. I started with one of the big 8 accounting firms back in 1988 in the tax group with Ernst & Winnie. Stayed 5 years, got my master's in taxation, my CPA license, and then decided to start my own practice at the age of 28. And I became president of a small business association, and that was the first time I got involved in politics. To understand that it's important that we have our voice at the table, that we are represented, and that we actively get involved in registering people to vote and making sure people do vote for those candidates that share our similar values, our vision, but also trying to help promote industries such as the cannabis industry. It took 8 years before I finally ran for office, and my first office was the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. And as many of you know, Prop 215, the legalization of medicinal cannabis, actually started in San Francisco. So it's always been, part of our world when I was on the Board of Supervisors, that it was more about access and making sure that people who needed it had access at an affordable price or even free. Then I got elected to the state assembly in 2006 to 2012 during the Great Recession. Cannabis certainly wasn't on anybody's mind, and so was never discussed. And then when I got elected to the State Board of Equalization in 2014, that was the first time that I heard that California was supposed to collect sales taxes from the cannabis industry, and that was specifically written into the Proposition 215. So my first question as the tax collector was, how much have we been collecting? And our agency did not know, partly because, number one, lack of banking access. Number two, since it was a Schedule I drug. Number three, people didn't understand what the laws were specifically. CPAs, accountants, bookkeepers, lawyers were not allowed to officially work with the cannabis industry because of the Schedule I nature. So it took 4 years for me to understand the cannabis industry, and I probably have equivalent of a PhD degree by now. We've done a lot of tours. We've talked to everyone and anyone in the industry who wanted to share with us their experiences, and was very active in trying to help shape the laws that were happening in the legislature before Prop 64 was put on the ballot. And in California, we have a very liberal initiative process where folks who have a couple $1 million can get signatures and put anything on the ballot that they want. And the legislature, in its wisdom, was trying to pass legislation to get ahead of the curve. And then Prop 64 was on the ballot. It passed overwhelmingly, and that became law of the land, and really negated all of the work that the legislature was working on. So for those of you who are in California, Prop 64 was very prescriptive in terms of what type of taxes. We have a 15% distribution tax. We have a cultivation tax. We still assess a state sales tax, which part of the money goes to the local government, but it also allowed local governments to assess its own tax. In order to get a state license, you had to get a local license, and it gave a lot of control and say to the local governments. And so what happened here in California is some jurisdictions would charge some industries an additional 40% in extra taxes. And it has become an issue that the legislature has been trying to fix. I was a co-sponsor on the Rob Bonta bill over the last couple of years to reduce the distribution tax from 15% to 11%, and also to waive the cultivation tax for the next 4 years in hopes that this industry would advance and flourish. Then what happened with COVID-19 2 months ago, the cannabis industry was considered an essential business. That's a good thing for the industry, since now all of the dispensaries and all of the distribution, the testing, cultivation activities was legally allowed to continue during these last 2 months. And then what happened recently this last week is that it took a toll because of all the looting that happened to all of the dispensaries, many of the dispensaries here in California. However, I thank Go Global for putting this on today. It is still a big economic driver in California, even though cannabis is legal, both medicinally and for adult use. The laws still are not fair from the federal government. Many of the companies, or all of the companies, they were not eligible for any of the PPP loans or the EIDL loans. However, in California, we have been trying to assist the industry as much as possible. But like Paul said, we still don't invest in companies, in cannabis companies. Some of the loan programs still don't apply to the cannabis industry. But with this governor, Gavin Newsom, leading the helm, he is a supporter of the cannabis industry, was one of the leaders to help Prop 64 pass. California still should be one of the golden, we are the golden state, but we should still continue our leadership position even during these tumultuous times. So I thank everyone for their interest. I know it's been really difficult over the last couple of years. We really need the federal government to allow banking access first and foremost. I testified about 1.5 years ago on the Perlmutter bill, the Safe Banking Act, and Congressman Perlmutter has been one of the leaders and really pushing for banking access. That ability to bank is part of the recent HEROES Act that passed the lower house, the House of Representatives. However, it gets stuck in the US Senate. So I implore folks, as we are approaching the November election and whatever the changes may be going to all mail-in ballots, that we focus on those senators who are on the banking committee who have been consistently blocking any sort of banking access. Now is the time to get involved. And because we are here talking about a little bit about getting involved, you know, your Congress members, your US senators need to hear from you, right? And in California, our coalitions are strong. We have many associations that have, you know, gathered together to lobby the legislature, and it does work. It does work. So we implore you to get involved. And before I end, I just want to put a pitch in for the US Census. Every 10 years, we count how many people are in a state. And for California, back in April, we received $9.5 billion through the CARES Act based on census-related data. So for us here in California, for every person who is not counted, we estimate it will cost $1,000 per person over the next 10 years in programs and services. And when it comes to federal assistance, as you can see how important it is to have every individual counted, right now is the time. It takes less than 2 minutes to answer 9 simple confidential questions at www.my2020census.gov. For those of you who have not done it, please do it. And we are counting folks at their location as of April 1st of this year. The deadline to do the census is August 21st. However, the Census Bureau is trying to extend that deadline to October 31st. However, it is so important that we make sure we get everybody counted. And for anyone who has questions, please feel free to email me at askfiona@treasure.ca.gov. I have experts that will answer your questions or put you in contact with folks who can answer your questions. And lastly, on my website, www.treasure.ca.gov, we have been compiling resource guides that are updated on a real-time basis. And those guides are for small business, individuals, tax relief, food, and even nonprofits during this time. And so we want to be a resource for you. I thank you for inviting me here today and listening to the conversation, but know that the cannabis industry is here to stay. It's just a matter of when we are going to actually be mainstream and also share many of the benefits and the privileges that every other legal business here in the US shares. So thank you all for being here today, inviting me, and just keep the faith. We will get through this stronger together.
Fabulous. Treasurer Ma, we're also grateful for your time today and frankly also for your advocacy on behalf of not only the cannabis industry, but all sorts of disadvantaged groups across the state of California. You're an inspiration to us all, and we look forward to your continuing contribution to the better society that we all want to live in. Speaking of that better society, I'm just reminding everybody that today's globalgo is providing a matching program for all donations made to Last Prisoners Project. If you want to move the needle on prisoner reform in relation to the cannabis industry, the best thing to do is to make a donation to Last Prisoners Project, which fights hard to get people that are incarcerated for the same stuff we're celebrating here today out of prison. Specifically, Black and brown people have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, and your money to LPP goes directly towards restoring a social justice. There's a link on the screen to guide you in that donation. Without further ado, though, I'm going to move on to our panel. I want to introduce Ryan Fingerhut, who's going to moderate today's panel. Ryan is a partner and a director of client relations at globalgo. He's a former practicing attorney who has devoted himself full-time to the cannabis industry since 2014. Ryan's specific focus is cannabis consulting, licensing, and compliance, and he boasts an unprecedented 99% success track record on all license applications with over 60 state and local cannabis licenses won in multiple states. We're really honored to have Ryan play a meaningful executive role at globalgo, and I'm thrilled to turn over the mantle of moderator to him to lead this informative panel that we're starting on now.
Thank you, Paul, for those kind words. And thank you, Fiona, for, well, that great amount of information and plugging some of the really great causes and issues that are affecting the cannabis industry today. So my name is Ryan Fingerhut, and I am going to get right into introducing the panel for you all. Our first panelist is named David Bright. He is an attorney with Zuber Lawler, whose practice focuses on white-collar and regulatory defense, investigations, and anti-corruption compliance. He has significant experience negotiating and litigating complex commercial, shareholder, and contract disputes. David's cases often feature complicated fact patterns that involve significant discovery disputes, especially in the areas of financial institutions or fast-moving bankruptcy actions. His clients span multiple industries and typically include media conglomerates, technology firms, financial institutions, and pharmaceutical companies. David has litigated cases in state and federal courts across the country and has also represented clients in FCPA, anti-corruption compliance, and internal investigations internationally. David's a graduate of Harvard University and the Columbia Law School, where he was a James Kent Scholar, and he also holds an MBA from the Trinity College in Dublin. Next, we have Gavin Kogan, who is the current chairman and CEO of Grupo Flor, an integrated group of cannabis enterprises headquartered in Monterey County, California. Gavin began his professional career as an attorney, focused on corporate restructures, out-of-court windups, and Chapter 11 debtors in possession representation. In 2011, Gavin turned into one of California's earliest cannabis business attorneys, where Gavin has been involved in cannabis politics and has represented many of California's early cannabis entrepreneurs. Gavin has co-founded multiple cannabis enterprises, such as Reaper, a powered hand tool for industrial cannabis processing, Indus Holding Company, now a publicly traded leading manufacturer and fast expanding California distribution company, and the aforementioned Grupo Flor. He's also been involved in a broad variety of smaller cannabis consumer brands, ancillary enterprises, and industry trade groups. Gavin is currently a member of the California State Bar Association, the California Cannabis Industry Associations, the National Cannabis Bar Association, and is a co-founding member of the California Cannabis Manufacturers Association. Next, we have Greg Asif, an attorney with Miller Thompson whose practice focuses on bankruptcy and insolvency law. Greg has worked with businesses from a wide range of industries, including banking and financial services, securities, information technology, mining, shipping, automotive manufacturing, media. Honestly, this list is very long, but rest assured, he has been involved in insolvency and bankruptcy law across many, many industries. Greg has acted in some of the largest and most complex restructurings in the country and has played a lead role in a number of international cases involving jurisdictions in the Americas, as well as Europe, Africa, and Asia. Finally, but not least, we have Mitch Hara, former head of mergers and acquisitions and business development for Clever Leaves International, Inc., formerly known as Northern Swan Holdings. This is one of the largest vertically integrated cannabis producers in the Western Hemisphere. His responsibilities included the company's investments, acquisitions, and business development efforts on a global scale. Including his cannabis experience, Mitch has over 30 years of experience in the retail and consumer product sectors from an investing, transactional, and operating perspective, and in highly disruptive environments. In addition to being an active angel investor, he spent over 20 years on Wall Street building M&A, restructuring, leverage finance, and industry practices at premier investment banking boutiques and bulge bracket firms. Mitch has originated, structured, and executed over 50 billion, that's billion with a B, in mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, restructurings, leverage buyouts, and structured debt and equity financing. So thank you very much, gentlemen. It's really great to have such an esteemed panel.
Thank you.
So jumping right into it, I'm going to go ahead and ask a few questions. I'm going to direct them for the most part to each of you, but if any of you wants to chime in or has something to say, please feel free to speak up. The first question I am going to aim towards you, David. So given the current economic environment, what Paul's described, what Fiona's described, not to mention the very complicated issue of how the US federal government is viewing the cannabis industry and the complications that come with that. What can cannabis companies facing increasing debt obligations look to do? What options do they have to pursue at the federal bankruptcy level?
Well, ordinarily, a company facing mounting debt obligations would jump to avail of federal bankruptcy protection. A company seeking to reorganize would file for Chapter 11. If you were looking to liquidate, you'd go under Chapter 7. Now, while cannabis companies are not expressly prohibited from seeking protection under the federal bankruptcy code, no cannabis company has been able to secure bankruptcy protection under the federal law to date. And the reasons for this, I think, are pretty obvious. The federal courts are simply not inclined to offer federal benefits to companies that they perceive are engaged in activity that's prohibited on the federal level. But as I said, there's no prohibition against cannabis company filing for federal bankruptcy. The issue is more so that your creditors, or more likely the trustee who would be administering the estate, are likely to challenge your ability to do so. Now, there's been some companies that have pushed the envelope in this area. In April of this year, United Cannabis filed for bankruptcy protection, Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in Colorado. And their case is somewhat unique in the sense that a large part of their business is CBD, so it's legal on the federal level. But nevertheless, the bankruptcy court, even in that situation, turned around and has forced the lawyers on behalf of United Cannabis to explain why the federal court should continue the federal bankruptcy, given the fact that the company is also involved in cannabis activity that's illegal on the federal level. It'll be an interesting case to watch going forward, but I wouldn't be optimistic of much change in that area in the near-term future.
That's unfortunate. So if federal bankruptcy, at least in the US, isn't really an option, what options are available for a cannabis company looking to restructure its debt under the law?
I mean, there's a large number of options available, and which option is best for you really depends on the size of your operations, the relationship you have with your creditors, how bad the distressed assets have become. But they broadly fall into two large groups. One would be state court-based options, and the other would be out-of-court options. The two most common court options are assignment for the benefit of creditors, or ABCs, and insolvency receiverships. In an ABC, a cannabis company voluntarily relinquishes control of the company to an assignee who thereafter manages the company. And that has a whole host of its own problems. The cannabis industry is so complicated and the operations are so specific that handing over the operation of a company to an assignee or a third party to run it creates a tremendous amount of risk for that company. But that's essentially how an ABC works, is you forfeit the operations to a third party. That party then operates the business on behalf of the creditors with the goal of liquidating the company. In many ways, it's the state equivalent of a Chapter 7 bankruptcy, except it doesn't have a lot of the federal bankruptcy protections. The other option is an insolvency receivership. And an insolvency receivership is also a state-based court option, very similar to an ABC. One of the key differences is that whereas an ABC is voluntary in nature, an insolvency receivership is typically involuntary. It's normally brought on by a creditor filing a action in the state court against you. And that's why at times like this, keeping good relations with your creditors is critical, because they do have the power to force you into a box. That said, insolvency receiverships are not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, involuntary receiverships are very flexible. They're very low cost in comparison to federal bankruptcies, and they often grant the company greater flexibility as a remedy. Now, in addition to those court supervised options, there's also non-court supervised options. There's compositions, there's extensions, there's out-of-court restructurings, and these are frequently used by cannabis companies, especially when you have good relationships with creditors, and when you have creditors who know that taking down the company or hurting the company is just simply not in their best interest. These out-of-court restructurings really are the product of extensive collaboration and negotiation with your creditors. And on top of all those options, you also have some innovative options out there that have yet to be tested, like those available under Chapter 15 of the Federal Bankruptcy Code, that may offer options to cannabis companies who have operations in both Canada and the US.
Thanks, David. That's actually an interesting point. There are several cannabis companies that cross state borders, especially, or sorry, not state borders, but international borders, especially between here in the US and Canada. Greg, I was wondering if maybe you could pick up on that and maybe explain the Chapter 15 option that David just mentioned. What exactly is that option? How successful it's been? People have been in pursuing it, if any have been successful in pursuing it, and your general thoughts in that area.
Sure. Good question. I mean, the starting point, I suppose, from the view from north of the border is this: cannabis is legal. Cannabis companies have access to the full range of insolvency regimes and processes that any other company would. So that's a good thing. That said, there are still complications in terms of how the mechanics work. For example, disposing of inventory is still a huge problem. The sort of prevailing wisdom is you're stuck with the inventory, can't do anything with it. For that reason, with a few very isolated exceptions, what we've seen so far are almost entirely debtor in possession processes, similar to your Chapter 11. The thought being that the company can restructure, it's a better outcome than being stuck with a bunch of inventory you can't do anything with. Now, to directly answer your question, what would happen in some other industry that was cross-border is a company could file in Canada, avail itself of the protections under our statutes, the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act and the Companies Creditors Arrangement Act, loosely Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 in your terminology, and then would file for a recognition order in the States. That said, we all know that, and as David just explained, we have this public policy problem, and it's still an open question as to whether or not courts are going to grant that relief. From what I understand, it's a slightly lower bar than would normally a company would be faced with under an 11, but it's still an impediment. The last big cross-border filing that I'm aware of is Green Growth. A bunch of entities filed in Canada under our CCAA. As far as I know, they have not taken any steps to have that recognized. What they did is they took the US entities and put it into receivership. I think people are still reluctant to take that step and push the envelope too hard because if the house of cards crumbles, it crumbles fast. Nobody wants to be on the losing end of that decision on a 15.
I can imagine, and that's very interesting. I'm sure we'll probably see sometime in the next few years somebody trying to take advantage of Chapter 15, but it's interesting to know that so far they've held back. So given the fact that there are many US companies that are trading on the Canadian Stock Exchange and there are many Canadian companies doing business here in the US, is there any type of Canadian bankruptcy protections that you would want to point out to those people in that situation that aren't really normally available in the US?
Sure. I mean, well, just further to my earlier comment, I mean, we have a regime that is very similar to Chapter 11. We have a fairly, I don't want to overstate this, but a fairly loose set of eligibility criteria. One of the things we often tell our clients is, look, if you open a bank account in Ontario or in Canada, you've brought yourself within the ambit of the statute. I know that's similar to, I think it's under Section 109 in the States, where a retainer agreement is enough to bring you within certain legislation. So that is probably available. That said, if most of the assets are in the US, if most of the customers are in the US, I'm not sure how far that gets you, because it's one thing to say there's a stay of proceedings. It's another thing to find out whether or not extraterritorial creditors are actually going to abide by that, given that it would be issued by a Canadian court. You still run into the problem where you need recognition in the US. So it's really a case-specific process. It depends on how the company is structured, where its operations are, where its pain points are.
Got it. Well, I guess the good news there is nobody's going to go through that process without contacting an attorney who's going to look at their specific situation. So hopefully that's where people go. Gavin, I actually think the next question should go to you, both because you're an operator in the space and a former and I think current practicing attorney. Can you tell us about some of the more business-oriented solutions to a distressed asset, such as assignment for the benefit of creditors, workouts that David touched on, any other area that you think people should be looking at as an alternative to the legal way of protecting yourself?
Sure. Well, the processes you just mentioned are legal. They're just not federal. I think that's not available to us. And typically, business that's failing, it has that opportunity to go, as David pointed out, Chapter 7, which is a total liquidation. That means lights out, game's over. we're selling all the assets. And then a Chapter 11, which is a, the benefit of it is that it holds off creditors from seizing assets and allows what we call a DIP, or debtor in possession, to reorganize and restructure their debt so that they can actually come out the other side. And contrary to, popular folklore that all that debt just evaporates, some parts of that do, but the idea of it is that the pain and the loss is equally spread among creditors, is the general philosophy. And so that's not available to us. And so, one comment, I'm an attorney. I practice, and that I practice, look at contracts, but I don't represent anybody else. I'm the CEO of Grupo Flor, and all my efforts are in relation to that enterprise. And we've had, like a lot of California operators, just a gauntlet of beatings, over the past 9 months that have just left a lot of us imperiled economically and continuity-wise imperiled. And so this conversation about is bankruptcy available, is it not available, is very, very on everybody's lips. And so the assignment for the benefit of creditors is a very useful tool. But as David pointed out, you're handing over the company to somebody else. And really the bargain is this for the creditors, is that somebody's home who's going to take care of the assets that cares about the creditors. That's the general idea of it. Management was unable to do it, so now an adult's going to come into the room and manage it. And that's sort of the general sale idea. The challenge with ABC is that it's a wind up. And so it can be, we call it an orderly wind up, right? So it sort of manages all the creditors as, pursuant to the bankruptcy code, but outside of the bankruptcy system. And it can be a very effective way to wind up a corporation, any entity. The difficulty in our industry is that there's so much value with the licenses and the assets and the farms and the dispensaries that it doesn't, if you were to do an analysis for a lot of these enterprises, you'd say, well, this is not a company to wind up. That's just a disaster for everybody. And so ABC isn't really a great fit because, and I've thought about this, not like some of the people on the board here, that really study this issues, but is there a way to use an ABC structure to restructure as opposed to wind up? And I haven't really looked into that, but the thing that I've always enjoyed about cannabis and practicing law in cannabis is you have to be really crafty, and you have to take structures that exist and put them together and come up with these sort of Frankenstein solutions that it's kind of the fun of it. That's the creative part of it. And so with ABC set aside, really the question is, can you bring in somebody to talk to your creditors in a way that makes them feel confident that the person whose home is going to help through this restructure? And maybe that's a little bit less than a formal ABC where there's not filings, but somebody, a creditor representative. I've seen creditor committees, informal creditor committees, where they grab a bunch of the creditors and say, you guys are our largest creditors. What terms would you agree on? And then you take the terms that they agree on and you go, force feed them to the other creditors to get them to buy along. And so a lot of the challenge is really understanding where your creditors, I know there's another question on this, where your creditors sit on the waterfall, but also how to use those different incentives of the different creditors and positions that they have against them and with them to come up with a common solution, being the company survives and everybody gets paid some amount of money, which is better than nothing.
Thanks. And that's really great advice, and I think a really good point. And just to expand on a little bit more, when you're looking at those creditors, how do you, at least Gavin, normally try to structure them, prioritize your debt payments in order to maximize how much time you have to, come back into the black?
Yeah. So, this kind of feeds into the other, the concept, like, what do you do when you're in, you're leading a company in this environment? I was appointed to my company after the 2019 collapse to sort of come in and try to restructure, I imagine a lot because of my background in this. And the very first thing I did was to look at how much spending was going on that the company's rate of return could not support, and figure out how quickly can I eliminate those things. And that is a very difficult process, especially for us in cannabis, where it takes sometimes years to get an asset, to develop out a permit, the lawyers, the accountants, the architects, and get everything going. And then just to say, I'm sorry, but I can't date you anymore, and hatch it, and it's gone. And it's very painful. You have to walk away from a lot of money. I know a lot of us in the industry have had to do that. Sometimes faster than there's a buyer that is willing to show up. Sometimes you just have to walk away from those opportunities. The next thing, obviously the most expensive piece and probably the most heart-rendering renting piece is your overhead. And what I mean by that really is your salaries, is the people you work with that you love, that were your band of brothers and sisters that helped you build your enterprise. And now which ones of them are you going to let go? And it's a very, very painful process. And in some ways, this is why a trustee or a debtor in possession representative or an assignee for the benefit of creditors can be really useful, because they can come in and make those extremely difficult decisions. Where oftentimes operators and the boards of directors are just emotionally unable to wrap their heads around some of those very painful decisions. Then looking at the creditor list, it really is, the waterfall. It's first your priority debts, which we think about as, it's bigger than this, but your tax obligations, but let's say all debts to government. And then your next is your secured creditors, that are people who have taken a collateral interest, kind of like when you buy a car, the finance that somebody takes an interest in their car and they're on your title. So you have a bunch of creditors that oftentimes, have an interest of that kind. They've collateralized your company. Whether it's licenses or equipment or leases and things like that. And then the next set is your unsecured trade creditor. And sort of sitting between the unsecured trade creditor and secured creditor are those unsecured trade creditors who went and got judgments, and they're called judgment creditors, so that they sit above the trade creditors. At the very, very last end of the line are the equity holders. And usually the founders of the company and the operators sit in that seat, and it's very, very, it's a bummer, because but that's how I've had to describe it to people I work with. I take $1 and I call it a waterfall, where you just go through and you see how that dollar is spent. And first all the tax money is paid, and then if there's anything left over, then it goes to secured creditors. If there's any money after that, then it goes to the judgment creditors. If there's anything after that, then it goes to the trade creditors, and so on down the waterfall. And so, sorry to be so long in the tooth about this, but short story is you try to take all those different interests, people clamoring to get higher up in the waterfall for their own protection. You try to come up with a plan that is going to save the company and give creditors the most amount of value that they can get. And it's a bit of a tug of war. It's like, if you push too hard, I'm going to flush the company down the drain. And then they have to back off a little bit. And so that's just really the nuts and bolts of it. Deal with the proposal that we're putting on the table, or we're just going to take the entire thing and flush it away. And that's really the nuts and bolts of the bargaining position.
Yeah, I myself have had to deal with companies that needed to downsize rather drastically. And so I know how hard those decisions can be, as well as the difficulties of dealing with the creditors who just, they don't want to hear that you don't have all the money that you owe them.
Yeah.
Mitch, I think that I'd like to bring this over to you, because I think that's a good segue. You've dealt extensively in mergers and acquisitions, and so you've probably been on both sides of this conversation as well. Is there any advice that you can give to our audience on how to properly leverage or secure debt in order to negotiate a more beneficial debt structure? As Gavin said, you can always walk away from the table. Cannabis is sort of a unique environment in that the operational complexity of running the asset makes it not desirable necessarily for a creditor to take over. Is there anything that you think that people should be focusing on when they walk into these negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we take a step back, and David started to touch on this in his discussion, I would say there are 5 aspects that one wants to consider when determining how best to proceed in some type of a workout or reorganization or negotiation with creditors. One is, liquidity. How much liquidity does the business have? How long can it operate? Are you close to or in default? I would say the next is the viability of the business. Near and long-term viability. Does it have a reason to exist? What is the quality and capabilities of management? And how important is the founder to that, or founders in that case? And then you have asset values vis-a-vis the liabilities. Are the asset values still effectively or theoretically greater than the liability, or is the reverse true? And then your creditor relationships. Are they good? Are they bad? Do you think you have leverage over them? Are they willing to work with the company? And what are your funding alternatives? What are your sources of funds? And unlike many other industries, cannabis, as we all know, because it doesn't have exposure to the banking system, is relegated to public capital markets to a large extent in Canada, to a certain extent in the U.S. But most of it is retail money that's funding the public markets, some institutions, but not many, and also the private market as well. And we're seeing more and more of those sort of creative financing solutions come into the market. So I think when you consider what your alternatives are, you have to take at least those 5 elements into account, and there are more. And I would say that, in a best case scenario, again, assuming that your business doesn't qualify for federal protection under, Chapter 11 here in the States, or 7, 15 for that matter, or, CCAA in Canada, your best hope is that you can arrive at some type of out-of-court settlement with your creditors. And that's assuming, you're hitting, on basically a best case scenario on all those 5 elements I mentioned, and that you have creditors who are willing and able to come to the table and restructure. And by the way, it's always better to be proactive than reactive in these situations, because if you're reactive, generally speaking, you're going to lose a fair amount of leverage in the end. So hopefully management teams have a good perspective as to what their liquidity looks like, their lifelines, and when they expect to run out of capital. Because the more advanced work you can do, the better off you're going to be in the end, and the more leverage you'll have over the entire, call it workout or restructuring process. In an absolute worst case scenario on the opposite end, going back to, what Gavin was saying before, if you're not hitting, all the high notes on those 5 elements I mentioned, you probably are looking to an ABC, for the benefit of creditors. And it really is for the benefit of creditors, because at the end of the day, that ABC basically allows management or the debtor to effectively walk away and ultimately turn the assets over to the ABC firm or the law firm or whomever the agent is that's administering the ABC. The one thing you want to make sure that in that instance is that if you are, the management or the debtor, you're not necessarily a sole proprietor, but you've at least incorporated, or you have an LLC, so they can't come after you and your personal assets in that respect. So that's one thing to consider in an ABC. But I would say best case, if you're lucky enough to have, the best possible scenario to your benefit and leverage with your creditors, you could try and do something out of court in terms of a workout, and a number of folks are doing that, just given the fact that, the debtor in possession laws here in the States aren't necessarily available to many potential debtors or distressed candidates. And the opposite is also true in terms of the, the ABCs. I would say, sort of the mid-range alternative there, and David touched on this too, is sort of your state receivership, which has a lot of similar aspects to the debtor in possession or Chapter 11 process in the federal sense, but allows for some debtor protection, if you will. In that sense, you have a receiver that's coming in and making all the decisions, whether or not they're going to be working in concert with management or not remains to be seen. But I would say in those scenarios here, at least in the States, the theory is that you could come out with some type of reorganized business where the equity still has a space or a spot in the new company. But in most cases, I think you're going to be looking at sale processes, and even then, in a state receivership process, you would have to be very, very careful as to which state you're essentially under the laws of, because Those state laws and procedures can be very tricky, time-consuming, and costly. And we're all experiencing this, and we'll be continuing to experience it for the first time, not only in terms of these companies, but at the state level. So not every state has procedures and processes in place to streamline this. And so I would say that, depending on, where you are, again, in those sort of, 5 aspects of consideration will determine how much leverage you have over your situation and your lenders.
Thanks. It's really great advice, Mitch. And I think that that's a really good point that people often forget, that one of the major complexities in the cannabis industry is that each state is its own market with its own rules that you have to adhere to. There's something else that you said that I'd like to touch upon a little bit more for both you and Gavin, which is being proactive. As you pointed out, it's much better to be proactive and try to get out ahead of your company facing distress than it is to only come to the table when you're in your final stage. Say another way, it's better to negotiate from a position of power, at least partial power, than a position of desperation. So given that, if you're a company that's in distress, but you're not yet facing, the end, what assets do you think are most appealing to purchase or sell for, to investors or to other companies? Do you think that people are more likely to purchase individual assets like real estate, major pieces of equipment, or do you think that it's mostly people are interested in the entire company as a whole, or in some type of association between, say, equipment and real estate and licensing?
I think that depends on the company and the assets and the business at hand, and who your potential, acquirers are, or what the asset values are. So, in a large vertically integrated company, there could be many, many different assets that either work together, and some can be, potentially pried apart, sold separately. So it all depends on the situation and who your potential, again, acquirers are, or investors, if you will. So I would think it's going to differ on a case-by-case basis. But even then, one needs to know exactly what the value of their assets are in terms of the whole versus the sum of the parts, if you will. And in certain instances, the whole is worth more, and other instances, the sum of the parts can be worth more. You might be able to generate more in terms of value by virtue of financing or selling them off separately, as opposed to the whole company. So it's going to be very, very situation dependent in terms of the individual company, the cases, and who the potential acquirer or investor universe is.
That's a good point. Gavin?
Yeah, right. If I can just riff on that, so my experience is specifically California. And one of the challenges, Mitch, that we have in California is that certainly in June to about March, the values of all these different assets classes were just fall. I mean, it was the conversation was, when does the knife stop falling, right? And so my advice to the operators, and many have already done this, but I think that particularly California operators, because there's really a lack of a coherent supply chain, and it's a very regional and balkanized economy around cannabis, a lot of us got into the mindset of we have to own we have to be vertical. Verticality was the sword that was bandied around in 18 and 19, and it was the holy grail. And so as a result, a lot of companies ended up with a lot of assets they couldn't operate well, or were in development and required more capital than what the market had available. I think that when what I noticed was that the companies that recognize the failing of the lack of capital liquidity and moved quickly to cauterize their losses and to eliminate assets are the ones that are around today. I think that the exercise also was a bit of soul searching for our industry in California, and that was, what are you going to be when you grow up? Are you going to be a cultivator? Are you going to be an extractor? Are you going to be a dispensary owner? Or are you going to be, the behemoth, the holy grail vertical across the board? And there was both sort of a spiritual soul searching for California and its Prop 215 culture and the people who started this industry, as well as for the operators that were failing at trying to be, the big dogs. There's a reason the MSOs have stayed away from California. It's a dangerous environment, and so I think that this is, while it's been extremely painful for me personally and for all of my collective brothers and sisters in the cannabis industry in California, it's also been a really interesting opportunity to look at what we're creating and ask the eternal question, or maybe not temporal question: what the hell are we building? Who do we want to be in it? And so I look at this as sort of an opportunity for that kind of reflection. And so that's really how companies get through this is they go through that and decide what kind of company do they want to be, and then they sell the assets that don't meet that purpose. And I found that there are buyers for every asset. It just is what it is. And frankly, sometimes the better thing to do, like I think a lot of my folks have found, that the people that you owe money to in some other avenue, they also owe you money. A lot of it's horse trading. Trade a farm for flour. Right? If you're an extractor and the farm is taking you down, get rid of the goddamn farm. But make sure that you get what you wanted out of the farm in the first place, which was stability of supply chain, out of the deal. So a lot of it is just kind of aligning interest and trying to shape up what kind of company you want at the end, and using the cards that you've acquired, your licenses as it were, and trading those to come up with your bet of how you will best operate in this industry in the near future.
It's interesting, Gavin, that you mentioned that. And one thing that came to mind, and Ryan, it goes back to your initial question, with respect to California, if you're looking to buy a license, I think you have to buy out of distress. I think you have to buy the whole company, not just the license. And then there's an issue with respect to the initial equity owners. And the theory is that there has to be at least 20% ownership prior to you acquiring that business / license. And then you may even have to close on that deal with the 20% holder in there, subject to your approval from the state to qualify to essentially operate that business and acquire that license. And so there's that risk there, in terms of an acquirer having, number one, to acquire the business versus the license, and ultimately hoping the acquirer can close once in terms of the 80% and then twice in terms of the 20 once they are approved. And so again, that's one of these, and California may be one of the most onerous states when it comes to that, but that's one of these state quirks that I think buyers, acquirers, investors, have to be very, very careful of before they enter into a distressed transaction in any means, in any one of these states, to do your due diligence as thoroughly as possible, and also to make sure you have really good legal counsel.
Yeah.
Absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. And I have to say, Mitch, it's even a little bit more complicated than that in California, since we have 3 agencies, and that's the rule for the BCC, and each agency has its own rules for ownership transfer. So yeah, it's definitely very complicated. So I think that the last question, since we're rounding out on the hour here, should go out to the general group. And that's sort of to round back to where we started this entire panel discussion, which is around the current crisis that's hitting the country, the world, and the cannabis industry, between the COVID and now civil unrest, the economic downturn that we're all facing because of those real world problems and issues. How do we see the impact coming to the competitive landscape of the cannabis industry? And are there any good things that we can take from that crunch? For instance, the fact that cannabis companies are being mostly declared a essential business, which helps to lend to the elasticity we've also seen in consumer demand.
Yeah. Well, just off the top, my sense is that, particularly in California, but I think throughout the nation, the cannabis legalization and these regimens have all arisen out of advocacy and out of strife and out of pain. So the culture is already steeped in advocacy and dealing with a really hard time and prejudice and unfair situations. And so it's a culture unlike other businesses in that it's rooted in struggle. So in some ways, I think our industry, never mind the fact that this has proven the inelasticity of our product, that the people actually want it when there's a hard time. I mean, that's an upshot. But I think that we're a really tough, scrappy group, and that culture, I think, makes us uniquely situated to get through this right now. To one of the comments that Andrew D'Angelo had made in the chat, I noticed earlier. Like, I think our path through this as a state and as a nation is to make more dispensaries available immediately. In other words, rip out local control and put in like sort of some mandatory population-based or community-based dispensaries. Because right now there's, I don't know, 800, 900 dispensaries in California. I mean, that's ridiculous, So I think that more dispensaries will stabilize this. And so to your question, I think that the chaos we're going through right now will encourage communities that are failing through our state. And there will be many, many, many communities failing in our state and suddenly desperate for money. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, cannabis and its essential operations might be the ticket to generate tax revenue. And I'm hoping that they might come up with some structures to make it quick so that shops can open up not in a year and a half after applying, but quickly. I think that would do a lot to stabilize the economy in California, and then so inform the rest of the nation as it kind of goes through this spasm that we're all feeling. I mean, as you know, I think something like 12 or 14 dispensaries have been looted in the last 4 days. So we're not out of the way of it all, but we're part of this whole process. And I think that's the way through is more dispensaries, and immediately.
Good points, Mitch. And I think a lot of that can be extrapolated to the rest of the country too. I've heard many state legislatures as well as local communities and states that have legalized mention cannabis and allowing more cannabis industry as a way of finding tax relief for the tax burdens that their budgets are going to be facing. Mitch, do you have anything to add to that, or Greg?
Yeah, I do actually. It's more of a cautionary tale than anything else. While I can appreciate, as Gavin said, the lure of a quick, easy, new sort of tax revenue stream, I throw this out as kind of a cautionary tale from our experience here, particularly in Ontario. It was very, very heavily regulated when dispensaries were first introduced. They had a very complicated lottery system. The market was massively underserved. It continues to be less available than I think the market demands. And as a result, this sort of promised panacea of tax revenue hasn't really materialized because our black market is so robust. I mean, the last estimate I saw, I think this was through the end of first quarter 2019, they were saying Statistics Canada pegged the market value at about, I think it was 8 billion rounding error, much more than half of which is black market. Now it's difficult to, for obvious reasons, difficult to pin a number on the exact number, but I know anecdotally, people just are, people are probably more comfortable going to the non-regulated dispensaries. Certainly they're more popular, they're cheaper. Anecdotally, they tend to offer better product. They're closer, they have better opening hours. I mean, all the things you would not want to see in a black market remain true. So you got to find the right balance between finding a way to monetize it and not going in with too heavy a hand that you sort of stifle legit and non-illicit sources.
Greg, that's absolutely a good point. The black market has been a thorn in the side of the regulated cannabis industry pretty much from the inception, and pretty much in every single market, especially in those like say California or Ontario, where it was established well before the regulated market came on. Mitch, David, I'd love to give you a chance to chime in here, but unfortunately, I think we're coming to the end of our time period. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Paul to close us out. Thank you, everybody. It's been a really great conversation. Really enjoyed the talk, and looking forward to speaking with you each in the future.
Sorry about that. That was super informative. Of course, I've been an entrepreneur my whole career, and a few times I've had businesses that have had to restructure, and I would have done better had I had the counsel of all the people on this panel today. Those were really illuminating strategies and insights that should help everyone feel a little bit calmer if they are happening to go through a restructuring. And I really do want to chime, I think it was Gavin's comment, that there's a buyer for all licenses, and that the idea that any of these businesses would be wound down without some form of succession, even in a restructure, is unnecessary, and something that I think if you bring your best approach and best energy and best strategy, you'll survive one way or the other. I'm really grateful to Treasurer Fiona Ma for providing such a great introduction. If Fiona was here, I would say the number one question I've seen on the chat is, where is tax relief coming for California cannabis operators? So to the degree that, Fiona, you're watching this after the fact, that's a central question to our industry. I don't like the word black market or regulated market. I look at it as we need to have one unified market, and there's plenty of entrants from the old market that can come in. But what we really need to do is allow the regulated market to compete on a level playing field, because on a level playing field, we're a better outcome for the consumer or the patient. And it's not about beating the black market. It's just about improving our deliverables to our customers and our patients. And overtaxing our industry prevents us from competing on a level playing field. So I do look forward to seeing some meaningful tax reform, and the industry will deliver everything that a regulator would want: good jobs, good tax base, no damage to Main Street, and really medicine for people in need. I want to thank all of our panelists, David Bright, Mitch Hara, Gavin Kogan, Gregory Azef. I want to thank Ryan Fingerhut, our excellent moderator today. And I just want to remind everybody that today's webinar is in support of Last Prisoners Project. In my opinion, the most impactful activist organization in our industry. For every dollar that's donated to Last Prisoners today, Global will match up to a $5,000 limit. You can find a link on the screen, but if after the webinar is over you want to donate, you can certainly reach out to any of the Global Go members to get that link, and likely it'll show up on our website. It's globalgo.consulting/LPP donate. Please be generous. This is a vital cause to our industry and will help create some of the good karma we need to return to that sense of optimism and hope that we all thrive on. Until next time, I'm Paul. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.